So 500 Hurricanes were created here at Brooklands. The prototype was developed here as well. This is an absolutely wonderful example of the aircraft type. As such, the Hurricane was a combination of what was old technology and new technology, in that the forward end of it had a new metal structure designed by Sidney Cam. Its wing was an excellent gun platform and generated a lot of lift, whereas the rear section of the aircraft was fabric and wood. And this lent the fact that the aircraft could absorb a fair amount of damage and at the same time be returned to service simply by patching it up. The workload of the Hurricane was predominantly targeted towards bombers that were coming across to devastate cities like Coventry, Birmingham, London in particular. And so by tasking them against bombers, they actually ended up with a higher kill rate than the Spitfire did, almost twice the amount. It equally would take on the German fighters, so it ate from the other person's plate. It wasn't just only for attacking bombers that were coming over to the UK. But between them, the Spitfire and the Hurricane achieved an enormous kill rate and supported our country during one of the darkest times, the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane itself, this particular one, was given to the United States so that those that volunteered in the early days of the Second World War could have an American squadron to operate in. They were called the Eagle Squadron, and as such, these were American citizens who privately volunteered, but because they were flying in a plane that was given to them, they were not deemed mercenaries. The aircraft was in service with the Americans for 2 years. And when America entered the war in 1941, the pilots were given a choice: either stay with the British squadron or join the American 8th Army or their fighting squadrons. That having been said, the aircraft then was surplus to immediate needs, and we had a new ally within the Second World War, which was Russia. So this aircraft found itself being operated within Russia to bring on a new front against Germany. They only had it about a month, and I'm afraid the pilot that was in charge of it on that occasion was a flying officer, Kalashnikov. And he was shot down, actually, whilst attempting to take off to intercept aircraft. The aircraft was taken to one side. It was badly damaged, but it didn't explode, and it was put in a barn. And it is an aviation approach, which was like a barn find. And at a later date, the aircraft was recovered and brought back here where it was built, and work was undertaken to restore it. We are fast approaching the anniversary of the Hurricane being created, and as such, I am sure that there will be certain celebrations around this aircraft to mark that occasion. But the significance of the aircraft is that this was loaned to the Russians, and within a decade we create another Hawker aircraft. We create the Hunter. And I say only a decade. It's quite interesting from a point of view that in such a short period of time, aviation has grown in technological terms to create something that would operate at 450 mile an hour, 450 knots, to something that actually will move at 720 knots and be able to achieve supersonic speed in a dive. The aircraft as such is a very simple but straightforward, efficient design. The first ones were rolled out in 1949, as I say, within a decade of that Hurricane being created. And it saw service with quite a few of what we would call today the NATO fleet, although it was in a period where NATO was just being created. So this one is a Danish one, and it would have operated over the Baltic. The three landlocked Soviet states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia meant that the Russians were operating out of Riga. They would come along the Baltic and then cross over Jutland and into the North Sea to the UK. This was stationed near Aarhus, not far from Copenhagen, and it would go out and intercept the Russians in the Baltic, and therefore act as a deterrent for what was considered at that time a real difficulty or a real possibility that nuclear bombs would be in these Russian bombers. This is in an era before Polaris, so the real threat would have come from the air. And from our point of view, we would have created other aircraft of our own, like the Vulcan, the Victor, and the Valiant. But the Russian Bears would come across the Baltic and present themselves as a threat to European countries. And this Danish one would go up to intercept it. If we look at the aircraft itself, maybe we can have a little walk around and look at some of its distinguishing features. The most important bit was, this is in an era before there are rocketry or weapon systems. So its primary armament were Aden cannons. There are 2 on each side, down near the footwells. So that would give you 4 Aden cannons. And this is the shell that they would fire. It's a 30mm shell, sometimes with explosive tips. And that's the part that would leave the aircraft and go in the direction of the target. The fire rate for this, with all 4 cannons in operation, would have been 80 rounds per second, which is a significant firepower. There would be, in the area just beneath the seat here, and is marked out by these lines here, is the silo that holds the shells, the cannon shells. 600 are held beneath the seat and are fed by belt feed into the Aden cannons. So 600 would be gone if you held your finger on the trigger in about 5.5 seconds. An extremely potent firepower. Later on in this aircraft's development, additional pylons are added onto the wing so that it could carry rocketry. But again, there wasn't so much as weapon systems. These would have been wire guided in the early days. But in the case of this particular aircraft, the single pylon was predominantly used for additional fuel. The reason being is that as an interceptor rather than a fighter, its primary role from a point of view of either the Danish one or particularly the RAF one was to accelerate as fast as possible to the North Sea to intercept Russian bombers that were on their way to our coastline. They did that by utilizing 300 gallons in this one. There is an identical tank on the other side. So there's 600 gallons that hang on pylons underneath the wing. There's a further 800 gallons that are in the main tank of the plane. Predominantly from a point of view of accelerating to the target, time on the target, and then returning to base, you had a 45-minute duration time during which 1,200 gallons of fuel were consumed. They passed the baton, so in other words, when the first aircraft came upon the Russian bombers would generally dither around deliberately so that the Hunter would use up its fuel. But then from another base further down the east coast, another Hunter or 2 would be scrambled so that the first Hunter could then return to base to refuel. So all the way down, there was a pass the baton approach to deter the Russians from coming near what would be the UK waters. That's 50 miles off the coast from a point of view of divisions. The aircraft itself, it had some inherent faults, but they were quite minor. The first being actually the guns. When they fired, the blast wave that came off the front of the aircraft, not only did it have dust and debris, but the blast wave meant that you were flying the aircraft through your own blast wave, and that blast wave was inducted directly into the engine. So it would cause the engine to stall or stammer. So they ended up putting baffles actually onto the guns. Now, they didn't realize this when they built the aircraft. It was very streamlined and very beautiful, but when you look here now, what looks like aftermarket welding is in fact aftermarket welding. They put these baffles on each of the guns so that the lot of the blast wave would channel down and then would avoid being inducted into the engine. Equally, from a point of view of the cannon shells, they also noted that the clips that held each of the shells together would cling to the airframe as it went down because of the speed. And the clips would then damage the tail or the speed brake. So these pods were created by the RAF. It was an RAF invention. So that the clips would tumble into this and not get into the airstream. This was known as Sabrina, named after a starlet in the 1950s and 60s, who was a rather full shape, let's just say. The actual cartridge would be propelled out of here because obviously the gas associated with the weapon meant that that could be expelled, and it had enough momentum to steer clear of the fuselage of the aircraft. The rear of the aircraft had quite a unique feature and needed to be understood a bit better. I've been very fortunate in that some of the visitors here have actually been people that flew the Hunter. If you look at the main tailplane, this cross-section here is free moving. In other words, they could alter the angle of attack of the tailplane so that it could, under certain conditions, it could be streamlined out. And this was quite a unique feature. A T-plane, they effectively called it. Later on in aviation development, because this worked on a jet fighter, you see it in the VC-10s, the Tridents and the 111, these high T-planes that are at the top of the tail. It was the same thing here. It was a magnificent design, and this allowed this aircraft to have variable pitch and lift, particularly as it went through different speeds and got near the actual speed of sound. The aircraft stopping is predominantly associated with this. This is the speed brake. So the activity associated with the aircraft meant that as it had closed in on the target, they would bring the throttle back, lower this out, and then that would give them a hold position at which they could then fire. And this would be recorded automatically by the nose camera within the aircraft, which we will show more of, both the nose camera and the internal controls. As you can see, the aircraft is very sleek. As such, it meant that the ability to detect the speed it was doing meant that they couldn't put what we would call in modern terms a pitot on the airframe. And so they end up with this beautiful pitot on the end of the wing tip so that it could actually capture the relevant details associated with speed, moisture, barometric pressure, and all of this is what made this aircraft, from a point of view of low technology, very flyable. I made an earlier comparison about the Hurricane. Although it's a decade on, most of the controls, which you will see shortly, within the Hunter are very basic and not too dissimilar from the Hurricane. The only addition to which is that it has information about the performance of the jet engine and the fuel consumption and the altitude. Other than that, it has no clever navigation system. It has a compass, but this is the leap that makes the big difference, because you're now recruiting different people. You're recruiting pilots that can multitask at high speed, and therefore all of the controls in here have to be operated manually at very high speed, and decision making is at very high speed. And a lot of that is the ability to look out the window with the Mark 1 eyeball, detect your target, and with instructions from the ground, climb to the right altitude to intercept. Maybe at this stage we'll talk a little bit more about the cockpit. So here we are, we're in the cockpit of the Hunter. It's quite snug, but actually it contains a minimal amount of information, the decision being made by the person sitting in the seat. So What you find in a later date of aircraft is that there's someone sitting behind the pilot helping make the decisions. So fuel consumption, navigation, targeting. In this era, it's about recruiting the right person, because this guy here is using the Mark 1 eyeball to look out through the glass and attempt to intercept a Russian bomber or whatever the target is. So how does he do that? Well, there's a couple of main controls. First of all, the joystick, as we would call it, as you can see, is handed. You have to be right-handed to fly this plane, or utilize your right hand to control the aircraft. The main controls that are on here is this button on the left. That operates the camera, which is in the nose, but equally the camera automatic comes on if you fire the guns. These are safe coverings, and that action there makes the trigger come out on the reverse side of the stick. It's done like that so that you don't actually unintentionally operate the trigger by confusing it with any of the other buttons. And to demonstrate what I mean by that, here's another button. In the case of this one, it would drop the wing tanks. Wing tanks are additional fuel, but they're also an additional burden. And should you be being intercepted, if you feel that you want to get away from that area, you would drop the wing tanks, and that would increase your acceleration and your speed. But generally speaking, they had no reason to drop the wing tanks, but this is the capability to do that. So you cover that one up because you don't want to drop them accidentally. You cover up the trigger because you don't want to fire accidentally. The only one that you really have from a point of view of interception is the camera. Primarily during the 60s, you would go into an intercept of a Russian bomber, say, and you would hit that automatically because you're gathering intel. You're seeing squadron markings, you're seeing modifications to these aircraft. And this is very important for the future of understanding how to act as a deterrent against the Russians coming over to our boundaries. So the aircraft was primarily an interceptor, where it shouldn't be confused with a fighter, because this is a dual role. It's to position yourself to protect your country, but have the firepower to back it up. The aircraft itself, from a layout, is a jet. So you have ideas of RPM, you have flow rates, but really a lot of the controls that are in here are not dissimilar to the Hurricane, which was only a decade earlier on. What does differ, though, is the ability for firepower. And as I say, the trigger here will let loose 80 rounds per second from the cannons, and the aircraft will react to that output by vibrating and, in some ways, changing its attitude. So the pilots are taught to be ready with that. Targeting for this aircraft was done by one primary mean, and that was looking out the window. So the throttle here for controlling the speed of the aircraft was multifunctional. And again, this was possibly why they had to recruit the right people, because you're not just accelerating. This is also the weapon system and the communication and the brake. I'll run through that so that it's understood. So you would find a target and you would turn this control here. And what that would do on the head-up display here, where there are two circles, it would move those circles back and forth until the target that you want is in the middle of the overlap of the white circuit. We can't bring this to life. We can only show it as a form here to demonstrate how it might look. But you would line your eyesight up with the head-up display, and so you would look out the window at your target glistening in the sky, and then you would move these to that target being in the middle. And the only way to do that is to position the plane. There aren't any other methods of aiming the guns. You point at where you want to go, and you use your power to back off or get nearer to the target, and then you move this accordingly to position it that when you're at the right range, you would fire the weapon. Equally, you would be directed to the target from ground radar, and this button here is your communications with the ground. So they would say to you, take a heading, and they'd give you what that heading was. and climb to 20,000 feet. So that's what you would do. You'd accelerate. They'd tell you where your target is. You'd confirm that by pressing the button back again. And then as you approach the target, generally at a very fast speed, you would back the throttle right off and then squeeze that. That's the tail brake. And what that does is it brings the aircraft to a much slower speed, and it gives you control as you approach the target to get your weapons on sight and remove it if that's what's required in this intercept. As the aircraft evolves over the years, the weapon systems change, and you get what we would call an electronic glass interception weapon systems, which you would find not dissimilar to a sat-nav and what you have in modern aircraft. But in these early years, in the 1940s and 1950s, it's Mark 1 eyeball. Later on, as other systems come in, they can put rockets on the aircraft, and then you can target individual rockets. But in this era, the early 1950s, it's all about recruiting the right people. You've got all the power you want, you've got decent weaponry, but you need people who can multitask. You have to bear in mind at the same time, they're making decisions about fuel, they're making decisions about intercepts, they're making decisions about weapons, and they also have to recognize their time on target, because you cannot spend undue time because you've got to get back to base so that you can reallocate. The other thing, it's a single jet engine, the Rolls-Royce Avon. It's immensely powerful, and you're using it almost at full blast all the time. So you keep one eye on this particular control here. It's basically the fire alarm device. In the aircraft, they normally record EGT, which is exhaust gas temperatures. And as you accelerate or decelerate, these EGTs move because that's the heat generated. But occasionally, this red light will come on to say you've exceeded the EGT, even though you've backed your throttles off. And that's a forewarning that you could have a fire in your engine. The solution for that is pretty straightforward. It's sprung loaded, the red light, and if you press that, that will enable the fire extinguisher. If the red light stays on, then you have to leave the aircraft. There isn't a solution to it. You now have an engine fire. Leaving this aircraft is quite straightforward, but today it is less complex. In this era, you would try and slow down as best you can, but you're going to go through the canopy, and on top of the seat, you will see there is a very small rounded spike, and that spike is what breaks the canopy as you go through it. In the modern era, there are detonation cords that shatter the canopy, or in some of the American aircraft, the canopy totally leaves the aircraft. But in this, you're strapped into your seat, complete with a backup oxygen supply. And the only way of getting out is two parts. Between your leg here is a chrome handle. You pull that, there's an almighty bang, and you're ejected through the canopy with a force of 40 G. Alternatively, you can reach behind you to the hoops. In some ways, that's a more satisfactory approach because you're sitting upright, you're in a good position to absorb 40 G. And as you pull those handles, a hood comes out. You have to bear in mind that you're going to go into a slipstream of 400 to 500 mile an hour, plus the debris associated with the explosion, which is splintered perspex and dust and muck. So that option is quite favourable because it protects you as you leave the aircraft. But either one will do, depending on the speed and need to evacuate the aircraft instantly. 40 G is used not because you need additional height for your parachute. It's to get you past your tail. This aircraft could be doing 500 mile an hour, but the 40 G is to get you an acceleration past your tail, which is following you, and that's why there's so much force in use. The challenge of 40 G means that as an individual, a third of the people that use the ejector seat on this aircraft in this era receive life-changing injuries. It's usually neck or spinal, but you survive. Those who are fortunate enough not to receive any severe injuries return to service. They're allowed one more ejection in their career, because a third one would be deemed, first of all, why have you had to get out of these aircraft on 3 occasions? But the other one is the likelihood of a continued damage to your neck and spine is quite likely. So the aircraft did everything it said on the package. It was right first time out, apart from modifications that were needed to the weapon system. The aircraft has got a marvellous engine, so much so that the replacement for this aircraft, which was the Lightning, equally ended up with the same engine, but 2 of them, one mounted on top of the other at the rear. The reason for creating the Lightning was to speed up the intercept. So the Lightning was a Mach 2 aircraft. This is just about Mach 1. And that reduced the amount of time to intercept the threat so that you could intercept the threat further out. But this aircraft is like also one of the best used cars. Because it was right first time out, it becomes very tradable. And so the RAF, and in the case of the Danish, these are traded down to other nations who want an interceptor, but they want a fighter, and they convert these into fighters, and they become a best-selling second-hand car. Whereas the front line, like the USA, the RAF, get new aircraft coming through and are constantly changing the fleet. So this becomes a very good hand-me-down. They were still in operation, complete with rocket systems, in 2014 with the Syrian Air Force, and they were highly successful in kills. The aircraft itself is only operated today in private ownership. There are 40 that are in private ownership. There are 2 with the Top Gun fighter school. They use it to chase aircraft so that they know the feeling of being chased by a supersonic aircraft. The reason they do it is, relatively speaking, these are still running. They're cheap to run by modern terms, and are very efficient at what they do. Generally speaking, they've always been single-seaters, so the real thing about this aircraft is the right people with the right skill sets. In modern warfare, aircraft are either supported with computers or a man behind that helps the pilot fly it. What makes this unique is the recruitment of the right people at the right time, and that's part of the story of the aircraft. Back in 1968, there was a squadron leader called Pollock, and he was very proud of the RAF and very proud of the missions that they flew. But he was disappointed that the RAF were not marking the 50th anniversary of the RAF in a way he saw fit. So he took the opportunity during one of his missions to fly one of these hunters through Tower Bridge. It was a unique experience. Because of the media in the 1960s, this made mainline news, but there was no camera footage of it. The RAF were put in a very difficult situation because of Squadron Leader Pollock, primarily because how do you deal with this? The public are now aware of it. So the manner in which he was dealt with was relatively low-key, so that they didn't have the embarrassment of actually having a public show of a man who had pride for the RAF at their 50th anniversary. And so he was quietly dealt with, but undoubtedly given a desk job or a sum of money to keep his side of the story quiet. And I think that really covers the bravado and strength of character that the people who flew in this aircraft had. They were a certain pilot of a certain type, the right stuff.